March 7th, 1945. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, Germany. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann stared across 400 feet of steel that shouldn't exist. Every intelligence report said German engineers had rigged every Rhine bridge for demolition. Every tactical assessment predicted the Wehrmacht would destroy this span the moment American forces approached. But there it stood, intact, crossing the last natural barrier between Allied armies and the heart of Nazi Germany. Behind Timmermann, elements of the 9th Armoured Division crowded the western approach, tanks idling, infantry crouched behind rubble. The bridge swayed slightly in the March wind. Smoke drifted from demolition charges already planted in its structure. German soldiers scrambled across the far side, clearly preparing to blow it. "We're going across," Timmermann announced to his platoon sergeants. The decision violated every principle of sound military tactics. Advancing across a bridge rigged with explosives, under direct enemy fire, with no knowledge of structural integrity or defensive positions on the far side. But the Rhine represented more than geography. It was Germany's moat, the defensive line that Nazi propaganda claimed would never fall to Western invasion. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Crossing the Rhine had obsessed Allied planners since D-Day. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had spent months preparing Operation Plunder, a massive set-piece assault scheduled for late March 1945. 25 divisions, 3,000 artillery pieces, elaborate amphibious operations, paratroop drops. Montgomery's plan was methodical, overwhelming, and entirely consistent with conventional military doctrine for river crossings against prepared defences. The Rhine was not simply another river. At Remagen, it flowed 300 feet wide and 20 feet deep, with currents reaching 6 miles per hour. German engineers had spent years fortifying the eastern bank with concrete bunkers, observation posts, and interlocking fields of fire. Every bridge crossing had been designated a critical demolition target since 1944, when Allied armies first approached Germany's western frontier. Wehrmacht doctrine was explicit: destroy all Rhine bridges before enemy forces could seize them intact. The mathematics of river crossing operations were brutal and well understood by both sides. Attacking forces required minimum 3-to-1 numerical superiority just to establish initial bridgeheads. Casualties typically exceeded 30% for assault waves crossing under fire. Defender advantages multiplied when bridges were destroyed, forcing attackers to rely on vulnerable pontoon bridges or amphibious operations. German High Command had calculated that destroying Rhine bridges would delay Allied advance by minimum 6 weeks, possibly 3 months, if spring flooding complicated crossing operations. That delay would allow Wehrmacht forces to establish defensive positions in depth, continue production of jet aircraft and advanced weapons, potentially negotiate separate peace with Western allies before Soviet forces reached Berlin. The strategic calculation was sound. The Rhine represented Germany's last geographic advantage, a natural barrier that modern military technology had not yet overcome with reliable crossing methods under combat conditions. But the calculation assumed German demolition teams would execute their orders without failure. March 7th's events at Remagen would prove that assumption catastrophically wrong and force American combat engineers to improvise solutions that violated every principle of safe bridge construction. The Ludendorff Bridge was a railway span constructed during World War I, designed to move German troops and supplies to the Western Front. Its twin towers on each bank housed machine gun nests and observation posts. The central span consisted of steel trusses supporting railway tracks, with wooden planking hastily added to accommodate vehicle traffic. German engineers had installed demolition charges at key structural points in January 1945, using both standard military explosives and improvised charges made from depth charges and artillery shells. The system was designed for redundancy. Multiple initiation points, backup detonation methods, and enough explosive power to drop the entire span into the Rhine within seconds of activation. Captain Willy Bratje commanded the Remagen Bridge defense with 300 Wehrmacht infantry, mostly older soldiers and teenagers from local garrison units. His orders were unambiguous: hold the bridge open for retreating German forces as long as possible, then destroy it immediately upon approach of American tanks. No bridge on the Rhine must fall intact into enemy hands. Bratsche understood the strategic implications perfectly. If Americans seized a Rhine crossing, they could pour mechanized forces across before German reserves could respond, potentially collapsing the entire Western Front and ending the war within weeks instead of months. On the morning of March 7th, Bratsche received reports of American armor approaching from the west. He ordered preparatory demolitions of buildings on the western approach to create obstacles, then positioned himself at the primary detonation point in the eastern bridge tower. The American advance toward Remagen was almost accidental. The 9th Armored Division's original objective was the town of Sinzig, several miles south, but Combat Command B, under Brigadier General William Hoge, received intelligence that the Ludendorff Bridge remained standing, and Hoge made an immediate tactical decision. Ignore the original objective. Seize that bridge if humanly possible. Lieutenant Timmermann's company from the 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion led the advance through Remagen's narrow streets. They encountered scattered resistance, mostly small arms fire from Wehrmacht infantry conducting fighting withdrawal. By early afternoon, Timmermann's troops had cleared the western approach and could see the bridge stretching across the Rhine to the far bank. What happened next remains one of the most debated moments in military history. German engineers activated the primary demolition charges at approximately 3 to 10 in the afternoon. The explosion was massive, sending debris and smoke hundreds of feet into the air. American soldiers on the western bank watched, expecting the bridge to collapse into the Rhine. But when the smoke cleared, the bridge still stood. The central span sagged slightly, visibly damaged, but the structure remained intact and potentially crossable. The primary demolition had failed due to a combination of factors that German after-action reports would later attribute to faulty explosives, damaged detonation cables from American artillery fire, and possible sabotage by impressed foreign laborers who had helped install the charges. Captain Bratsche attempted to activate backup demolition systems, but the electrical connections had been severed by the partial explosion. German engineers rushed onto the bridge with Bangalore torpedoes, attempting manual demolition under increasingly heavy American fire. Machine gun fire from Timmermann's infantry positions drove them back into the eastern tower. At 3:20 in the afternoon, Timmermann received direct orders from his battalion commander: take your company across that bridge. Now. The tactical situation was unprecedented. Every officer present understood that crossing a partially demolished bridge under enemy fire violated fundamental military doctrine. The structure's stability was unknown. German engineers were clearly still attempting to complete demolition. Defensive fire from the eastern bank would inflict heavy casualties on troops trapped on the narrow span with no cover. But the strategic opportunity was equally obvious. If American forces could establish a bridgehead on the Rhine's eastern bank, the entire German defensive strategy would collapse. Montgomery's elaborate crossing operation would become unnecessary. The war might end weeks or even months earlier than current planning assumed. Timmermann assembled his 3 platoon leaders and issued orders that would earn him the Distinguished Service Cross within 48 hours, or result in his court-martial if the crossing failed catastrophically. We're going across in single file. Maximum spacing between men. Move fast, but don't run. If the bridge goes down, you go with it. Sergeant Alex Drabik led the first squad onto the bridge, moving at a steady walk despite German machine gun fire from the eastern tower. The wooden planking was torn and splintered from the demolition attempt. Gaps in the decking revealed the Rhine flowing 20 feet below. The entire structure swayed with each step, steel trusses groaning under stress loads they were never designed to sustain after partial demolition. Drabik would later describe the crossing as the longest 400 feet of his life. Every step brought expectation of either the bridge collapsing or German engineers successfully detonating remaining charges. Small arms fire from both banks created a continuous cracking sound. Mortar rounds began falling as German artillery observers identified the crossing attempt. Behind Drabick, Timmermann's entire company was strung out across the bridge in a vulnerable line that would have been suicidal under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. This was the Rhine, the barrier that Nazi propaganda had declared impregnable, now crossed by American infantry moving at walking pace under fire. At 3:30, Sergeant Drabick became the first Allied soldier to reach the eastern bank of the Rhine. Within minutes, his squad had cleared German defenders from the bridge tower and begun establishing defensive positions in the rubble of Erpel, the town on the eastern side. Timmermann's remaining platoons followed, suffering casualties from German fire, but maintaining forward momentum. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 200 American infantry had crossed the Ludendorff Bridge and were expanding the bridgehead against confused German resistance. Wehrmacht units in the area had received no contingency orders for defending against an actual Rhine crossing, as doctrine assumed all bridges would be destroyed before enemy forces could seize them. The strategic implications became immediately apparent at every level of command. Within hours, General Eisenhower ordered maximum priority given to exploiting the Remagen bridgehead. Every available unit in the sector was directed toward the crossing, but Eisenhower and his staff understood the critical limitation. The Ludendorff Bridge was damaged, potentially unstable, and would likely collapse under heavy military traffic. To exploit the breakthrough, American forces needed additional crossing capability, and they needed it immediately. This was where conventional military engineering doctrine encountered impossible reality. Standard Army field manuals specified that bridge construction across rivers the size of the Rhine required minimum 2 weeks of preparation, specialized equipment, and ideal weather conditions. Current conditions were far from ideal. The Rhine was running high with spring snowmelt. German artillery could range the entire crossing area. The Ludendorff Bridge's structural integrity was deteriorating hourly under the weight of constant military traffic. Colonel H. Wallace Anderson commanded the 11th 111th Engineer Combat Group, responsible for all engineering operations in the 1st Army sector. He received orders at 1800 hours on March 7th. Get crossing capacity established at Remagen immediately. Use whatever methods necessary. Time is more critical than safety margins. Anderson had spent 22 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, building bridges according to strict specifications that balanced structural requirements against available materials. What First Army was now ordering him to do violated every engineering principle he had learned. Build bridges across a major European river under enemy artillery fire, using whatever materials could be scrounged locally, with no time for proper site surveys or foundation work. The engineering challenge was immense. Pontoon bridges required specially designed floating sections that could be anchored against Rhine currents. Treadway bridges needed steel components that weren't available in sufficient quantity in the forward area. Fixed bridges required massive foundation work impossible under current combat conditions. Anderson studied maps and equipment inventories by flashlight in a command post 4 miles west of Remagen. His engineer battalions had standard military bridging equipment, but all of it was designed for rivers much smaller than the Rhine. The pontoon sections would be overwhelmed by current and debris. The treadway spans were too short for the 300-foot width. Traditional fixed bridge construction would take weeks, even without enemy interference. The solution came from Captain William McKinley of the 2nd 196th Engineer Combat Battalion, an officer who had worked in civilian construction before the war. "We don't build to code," McKinley suggested during the midnight planning conference. "We build temporary crossings that last just long enough to get vehicles across. Then we replace them. Continuous construction and replacement." Anderson understood immediately what McKinley was proposing. Instead of building bridges designed for permanent use or even extended temporary service, create throwaway structures that prioritized speed of construction over durability or safety margins. The bridges would be marginally stable, potentially dangerous, and would likely fail after limited use, but they would provide crossing capacity within hours instead of weeks. "This will get men killed," Anderson stated flatly. "Bridge failures under load, Structural collapses, vehicle accidents. McKinley nodded. Yes, sir, but fewer men than waiting for Montgomery's operation in 3 weeks, while Germans reinforce the eastern bank. The first emergency bridge construction began at 0200 hours on March 8th. The 296th Engineer Combat Battalion started assembling a heavy pontoon bridge 400 yards downstream from the Ludendorff Bridge. They were working under blackout conditions to avoid German artillery observation, using only hooded flashlights and moonlight to guide construction. The engineering challenge was unprecedented. Rhine currents at Remagen flowed at approximately 6 miles per hour, fast enough to tear apart improperly anchored pontoons. The river bottom was rock and gravel, making anchor placement extremely difficult. Water temperature was just above freezing, meaning engineers working in the water faced hypothermia within minutes of immersion. Standard Army doctrine called for pontoon bridge construction to begin from both banks simultaneously, meeting in the middle, but German forces still controlled the eastern bank in most locations, forcing American engineers to construct from the west bank only, floating completed sections across the current while under sporadic artillery fire. Sergeant Harold Deacon commanded the lead construction squad. He had supervised bridge building in northern France and Belgium, but never under conditions remotely comparable to Remagen. The current kept ripping pontoons loose, he would later report. We'd get 3 sections connected, anchor them, start on the buttock, fourth, and the whole thing would break free. We lost 2 complete bridge sections in the first 4 hours. The standard safety protocols were abandoned out of necessity. Engineers worked in ice-cold water without proper immersion suits. Anchor cables were secured with whatever materials could be found locally, including lengths of German communications wire scavenged from defensive positions. Bridge sections were connected using improvised methods when standard connection hardware proved inadequate for Rhine conditions. By dawn on March 8th, the pontoon bridge had reached only halfway across the Rhine. Worse, German artillery observers had identified the construction effort and begun systematic targeting of the crossing site. The first artillery barrage killed 4 engineers and destroyed 2 pontoon sections that had taken hours to position. Colonel Anderson made a critical decision. Rather than halt construction until better conditions or equipment became available, he ordered simultaneous work on multiple crossing sites. If one bridge was destroyed by artillery, others would still provide crossing capacity. If currents destroyed pontoon sections at one location, different approach angles at other sites might succeed. The result was organized chaos along 2 miles of Rhine riverfront. 6 separate engineer battalions worked simultaneously on 8 different crossing projects. Heavy pontoon bridges, light pontoon bridges, treadway bridges, even experimental floating causeways that engineers improvised from captured German bridging equipment. The common factor was that none of the bridges were being built according to established specifications or safety standards. Lieutenant Joseph Gerber supervised construction of a treadway bridge at a crossing site designated Bridge Site 3. His battalion had brought standard M2 treadway equipment designed for rivers up to 150 feet wide. The Rhine at his crossing point was 320 feet. We literally didn't have enough bridge, Gerber explained in after-action reports. So, we built it in 2 sections with a floating pontoon section in the middle. The center section was supposed to be temporary, but it stayed in service for 3 days before we could replace it with proper treadway. The makeshift center section was held in place by cables, anchored to disabled German vehicles on the eastern bank and concrete blocks on the western side. Under normal circumstances, Army engineers would never have certified such a structure for even light vehicle traffic, but these were not normal circumstances. First vehicles crossed Gerber's Bridge at 1400 hours on March 8th, less than 14 hours after construction began. A jeep made the crossing successfully. A supply truck followed, and the improvised center section sagged visibly under the load. The third vehicle, another truck, was halfway across when the center pontoon shifted, tilting the roadway 30 degrees. The truck driver managed to maintain control and complete the crossing, but Gerber immediately halted traffic for emergency repairs. We jacked up the center section using engineer equipment as temporary supports, added more anchor cables, and reinforced the pontoon with empty fuel drums lashed underneath for additional flotation, his report detailed. The modifications took 40 minutes. Then we reopened the bridge for traffic and hoped it would hold. The bridge held for 72 hours of continuous military traffic before structural failure forced its closure for complete reconstruction. In that time, over 500 vehicles and 3,000 troops crossed into the Remagen bridgehead. Gerber estimated that by civilian engineering standards, the bridge should never have been approved for use. By military necessity standards, it was exactly what the situation required. Similar scenes played out at every crossing site along the Remagen sector. Bridges that were marginally stable at best, held together by improvisation and luck as much as engineering skill. Structures that violated every safety regulation in the Army Field Manual, but provided the crossing capacity that tactical necessity demanded. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German response to the Remagen crossing developed with characteristic Wehrmacht efficiency. Once senior commanders grasped the strategic disaster unfolding on the Rhine, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the west, immediately ordered all available artillery within range to target the crossing sites. By March 9th, over 100 German artillery pieces were firing continuously at the American bridgehead and bridge construction areas. The artillery bombardment was systematic and devastating. German forward observers in church steeples and on high ground east of the Rhine could probablement see American bridge construction efforts clearly. They adjusted fire with professional precision, walking shells across pontoon bridge sections, targeting engineer work parties, attempting to destroy the damaged Ludendorff Bridge that still carried the majority of heavy traffic. Casualties among American engineer units climbed rapidly. The 98th Engineer Combat Battalion lost 43 men killed or wounded in the first 72 hours at Remagen. The 51st Engineer Combat Battalion suffered 37 casualties. These were loss rates comparable to infantry units engaged in direct assault operations, but the engineers were supposedly working in rear areas conducting support missions. The reality was that bridge construction at Remagen had become frontline combat. Engineers worked under constant artillery fire, making structural calculations while shells exploded in the river around them. They welded steel components together while machine gun fire from German positions across the Rhine kicked up sparks on metal surfaces. They positioned heavy pontoon sections while mortar rounds created geysers of water that capsized boats and swept men downstream. Technical Sergeant Michael Bishop of the 51st Engineers described the conditions in a letter written 3 days after the crossing. "We work in shifts because nobody can stand more than 4 hours of the shelling before they start making mistakes. The noise is constant. Explosions in the water, explosions on the banks, explosions hitting the bridges themselves. You learn to judge by the sound whether a shell is going to hit near you. The ones you hear aren't the problem. It's the ones you don't hear that kill you." Despite the casualties and impossible working conditions, bridge construction continued 24 hours per day. Colonel Anderson had calculated that the bridgehead required minimum 3 operational crossings to sustain the build-up of forces necessary to break out from the tier Rhine and advance into Germany's interior. The damaged Ludendorff Bridge provided 1 crossing, though its structural integrity deteriorated daily under the weight of constant military traffic and German artillery impacts. By March 10th, American engineers had completed 2 additional pontoon bridges and were working on a 4th treadway crossing. The bridges were not safe by any conventional standard. They swayed under vehicle loads, shifted with river currents, and required constant emergency repairs to remain functional. But they were operational, and that was all that mattered. The German Luftwaffe made its final significant appearance of the war, attempting to destroy the Remagen bridges. On March 10th and 11th, formations of Me-262 jet fighters conducted high-speed bombing runs against the crossing sites. The jets were nearly impossible to intercept with conventional Allied fighters due to their superior speed, but their bombing accuracy proved inadequate against narrow bridge targets. American anti-aircraft battalions had ringed the bridgehead with over 600 anti-aircraft guns, creating the densest concentration of AA fire in the European theatre. When German jets appeared, the sky filled with explosive shells and tracer fire. Several jets were damaged or destroyed, but they succeeded in dropping bombs that narrowly missed the Ludendorff Bridge and damaged one pontoon crossing, killing 12 engineers who were conducting repairs. The human cost of maintaining the bridges became evident in medical evacuation statistics. Field hospitals 4 miles west of Remagen were treating an average of 60 engineer casualties daily from artillery fire, structural accidents, and hypothermia from working in ice-cold water. These numbers didn't include the vehicle accidents that occurred when trucks or tanks attempted to cross unstable bridges at speeds too fast for structural conditions. Captain William Hancock commanded a medical clearing station that processed engineer casualties throughout the Remagen operation. His records documented injuries that illustrated the desperate nature of bridge construction under combat conditions. Severe lacerations from exploding pontoon sections, crush injuries when bridge components shifted under load, burns from welding operations conducted while under fire, hypothermia severe enough to require immediate evacuation. These men were taking casualties at rates comparable to assault infantry, but they were building bridges, not attacking enemy positions. The engineering innovations continued out of sheer necessity. When standard anchor cables proved inadequate for Rhine currents, engineers began using chains scavenged from damaged German industrial equipment. When pontoon sections were damaged beyond normal repair capability, maintenance crews welded empty fuel drums underneath them to restore flotation. When approaches to bridge sites became cratered by German artillery, bulldozer operators filled holes while under fire, working in shifts measured in minutes because sustained exposure to the shelling was unsurvivable. By March 12th, 5 days after the initial crossing, the Remagen bridgehead had expanded to include over 50,000 American troops and substantial quantities of armor and artillery. The build-up would have been impossible without the emergency bridges, despite their marginal stability and continuous need for repair. General Omar Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group, understood the strategic significance immediately. The Remagen bridgehead is costing us casualties among engineers comparable to frontline combat operations, he wrote in situation reports to Eisenhower. But it's allowing us to establish a position east of the Rhine that makes Montgomery's elaborate crossing operation unnecessary. We can break out from Remagen and drive into Germany's industrial heartland ahead of any timeline we'd previously considered possible. But the Ludendorff Bridge, the structure that had made the entire operation possible, was dying. Army engineers had been monitoring its structural integrity since March 7th, and their reports painted an increasingly alarming picture. The partial German demolition had damaged key load-bearing components. Continuous heavy traffic had stressed the structure far beyond its designed capacity. German artillery had scored multiple direct hits, weakening trusses and support cables. The bridge was literally sagging into the Rhine, dropping several inches daily as steel components bent under impossible loads. On March 15th, engineers installed emergency shoring beneath the central span, using timber supports positioned on pontoon sections floated beneath the bridge. The shoring bought time, but structural engineers estimated the bridge had perhaps 48 to 72 hours of service remaining before catastrophic failure became inevitable. Colonel Anderson faced an agonizing calculation. The Ludendorff Bridge was still the most capable crossing in the sector, able to handle the heaviest vehicles, including tanks and artillery prime movers, that the pontoon bridges could not safely accommodate. Closing the bridge would immediately reduce crossing capacity by approximately 40%, potentially stalling the build-up of forces necessary to break out from the bridgehead. But keeping the bridge open risked a collapse under load that could kill dozens or hundreds of troops and vehicles. At 10:55 on the morning of March 17th, the decision was made for him. The Ludendorff Bridge collapsed into the Rhine. The failure began at the southern tower, where damaged structural supports finally gave way under accumulated stress. The central span twisted steel trusses shrieking as they bent beyond their elastic limit. Within seconds, 400 feet of steel and concrete plunged into the river, taking with it approximately 30 American engineers who had been conducting emergency repairs on the deck. The collapse created a massive splash, visible for miles, sending waves across the Rhine that rocked pontoon bridges and swamped small boats. The sound was heard throughout the bridgehead, a thunderous crash followed by the groaning of twisted metal settling into the river bottom. 28 engineers died in the collapse. Another 63 were injured, many with severe crush injuries or drowning-related trauma. The rescue operations began immediately, with engineer boats and swimmers searching the debris field for survivors. Several men were pulled from the water alive, trapped in pockets of air within the collapsed structure. Others were recovered from the eastern bank, swept downstream by currents after being thrown clear of the falling bridge. The investigation into the collapse began within hours and would ultimately conclude that structural failure was inevitable, given the combination of German demolition damage, continuous heavy, traffic beyond design specifications, artillery impacts, and inadequate time for proper repair of critical components. No individual negligence was found. The bridge had simply been asked to do more than physics would allow. But by March 17th, the collapse no longer represented a strategic catastrophe. American engineers had constructed enough alternative crossings to sustain operations even without the Ludendorff Bridge. At the time of its collapse, 7 pontoon bridges and 2 treadway bridges were operational in the Remagen sector, providing aggregate crossing capacity that actually exceeded what the damaged Ludendorff Bridge had been carrying in its final days. The engineering achievement was unprecedented in military history. In 10 days, American combat engineers had established crossing operations across the Rhine under continuous enemy fire, using improvised methods and accepting casualty rates that peacetime engineering would consider catastrophic. The bridges they built violated every safety regulation in the Army Field Manual. But they worked. Colonel Anderson's after-action report, filed on March 20th, documented the human cost with clinical precision. Total engineer casualties from March 7th through March 17th. 183 killed, 412 wounded, 27 missing. Vehicle losses from bridge accidents and structural failures. 68 trucks, 14 tanks, 3 tank destroyers, numerous smaller vehicles. Bridge failures requiring emergency closure and repair. 47 incidents. Average operational lifespan of emergency bridges before requiring major repair, 72 hours. The report concluded with an assessment that would be studied at Army engineer schools for decades afterward. Standard bridge construction doctrine proved inadequate for Rhine crossing operations under combat conditions. Success required systematic violation of safety regulations, acceptance of casualty rates, approaching infantry assault operations, and willingness to construct temporary structures with marginal stability and high failure rates. The alternative was waiting for ideal conditions that would never arrive under tactical circumstances. The German perspective on Remagen reflected profound frustration with the failure to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge and inability to prevent American engineers from establishing alternative crossings. Captain Willy Bratke, who had commanded the bridge defences, was court-martialed by the Wehrmacht for failing to demolish the bridge before American capture. He was sentenced to death, though the sentence was never carried out as German military authority collapsed in the final weeks of the war. German military analysis of the Remagen operation focused heavily on American engineering capability as a decisive factor in the Western Front's collapse. Wehrmacht situation reports from late March 1945 noted that American forces had achieved crossing operations that German planning staffs had calculated would require minimum 6 weeks to execute. The speed and improvisation demonstrated by American combat engineers had essentially invalidated German defensive strategy for the Rhine barrier. Field Marshal Kesselring's final report on the Remagen operation, written after the war, acknowledged that German doctrine had failed to account for enemy willingness to accept casualties and structural risks that Wehrmacht planning considered unacceptable. The Americans built bridges that our engineers would have condemned as unsafe for any use, but they built them quickly, under fire, and in sufficient quantity to overwhelm our defensive capabilities. This represented a fundamental difference in military culture. We sought perfect execution of proper procedure. They sought adequate execution of whatever procedure achieved results. The strategic impact of the Remagen crossing extended far beyond the immediate bridgehead. Once, American forces had established positions east of the Rhine in strength. The entire German defensive strategy for Western Germany collapsed. Wehrmacht units that had been positioned to defend against Montgomery's elaborate crossing operation in the north found themselves flanked by American forces advancing from Remagen. German mobile reserves that should have been available to counter Montgomery's assault were instead committed to futile attempts to eliminate the Remagen bridgehead. By late March 1945, American forces were breaking out from Remagen and driving northeast toward the industrial Ruhr region. The rapid advance was possible only because the improvised bridges at Remagen had allowed build-up of sufficient forces and supplies to sustain offensive operations deep into German territory. Within 6 weeks of the initial crossing, American armies had advanced over 200 miles into Germany, accepted the surrender of over 300,000 Wehrmacht troops in the Ruhr pocket, and were approaching link-up with Soviet forces advancing from the east. The engineering lessons from Remagen would influence American military doctrine for decades. The willingness to accept marginal structural stability in exchange for rapid construction became a principle of combat engineering that balanced safety against tactical necessity. The Army revised its field manuals to include procedures for emergency bridge construction under fire, explicitly acknowledging that combat conditions often required violation of peacetime safety standards. Staff Sergeant Harold Deacon, who had supervised the initial pontoon bridge construction, received the Silver Star for his actions at Remagen. His citation noted that he had remained at his post conducting bridge repairs while under continuous artillery fire for 72 consecutive hours, personally preventing multiple structural failures that would have closed critical crossings. Dozens of other engineers received similar decorations, though many felt the recognition was inadequate for the casualties their units had sustained. The human stories from Remagen illustrated both the cost and the character of combat engineering under impossible conditions. Private First Class Eugene Ekstam was working on emergency repairs to a pontoon bridge when German artillery scored a direct hit on the section immediately adjacent to his position. The explosion killed 3 engineers and left a 15-foot gap in the bridge, while vehicles were backed up waiting to cross. Ekstam, though wounded by shrapnel, spent the next 4 hours directing salvage of undamaged pontoon sections and improvising a temporary span using materials scavenged from a destroyed German bridge nearby. His actions kept the crossing operational during a critical period when other bridges were closed for repairs. Lieutenant Joseph Gerber, whose improvised treadway bridge had served for 72 hours before structural failure, received orders on March 21st to rebuild the crossing, using proper materials and techniques now that tactical circumstances permitted more deliberate construction. He discovered that combat engineering under fire had fundamentally changed his approach to the profession. I had learned to calculate structural requirements based on good enough for now, rather than safe under all conditions, he wrote in a letter home. The Rhine taught me that sometimes adequate and immediate beats perfect and delayed, but it also taught me the cost. I attended memorial services for 19 engineers from my battalion who died building bridges that I designed knowing they were marginally stable at best. The memorial services were conducted throughout April 1945 as American forces consolidated control of Western Germany and combat operations wound down toward final German surrender. Engineer units gathered at cemeteries near Remagen to honor the men who had died building the bridges that made the Rhine crossing possible. The services were somber acknowledgement that the engineers had suffered casualties comparable to infantry assault units, despite being supposedly in support roles rather than direct combat. Captain William McKinley, who had first proposed the concept of throwaway bridge construction, reflected on the ethical dimensions of engineering decisions made at Remagen. We knowingly built structures that had high probabilities of failure. We understood that men would die in construction accidents and bridge collapses. We made those decisions because the alternative was worse. allowing the war to continue for additional months with vastly higher casualties. But understanding the necessity doesn't eliminate the moral weight of decisions that cost specific, identifiable lives in exchange for abstract strategic advantage. The debate about acceptable risk in combat engineering would continue in military schools and staff colleges for decades after the war. Remagen became the case study in balancing safety against tactical necessity, illustrating both the potential and the cost of aggressive engineering under fire. The bridges themselves, those improvised structures held together by scavenged materials and desperate innovation, served for varying periods after the initial crisis passed. Some were replaced within days by more substantial crossings built to proper specifications. Others remained in service for weeks or even months, continuously repaired and reinforced but never quite meeting peacetime safety standards. The last of the original Remagen emergency bridges was finally replaced in July 1945, 4 months after its construction. By that time, the war in Europe had ended, and the bridges that had once been vital strategic assets became routine logistics infrastructure supporting occupation forces. But the engineers who had built them under fire remembered. Reunions of Remagen engineer veterans occurred regularly in the decades after the war, gatherings where aging men who had worked together building impossible bridges under German artillery could share memories that civilians could never fully understand. The conversations at these reunions often returned to the same themes: the terror of working in ice-cold water while shells exploded nearby, the guilt of surviving when friends died in bridge collapses, the pride in having achieved something that military doctrine said was impossible. By the 21st century, few Remagen engineer veterans remained alive. The last reunion occurred in 2008, attended by 17 men, all in their 80s, who travelled to Remagen to stand once more on the banks of the Rhine, where they had worked under fire 6 decades earlier. They visited the memorial that Germany had erected, honouring both the German defenders and American attackers who fought at the bridge. They walked along the riverbank where pontoon bridges had once crossed, trying to explain to grandchildren what it had been like to build bridges while people were actively attempting to kill you. The engineering calculations that seemed so desperate and improvised in March 1945 had been vindicated by results. The Rhine crossing at Remagen had succeeded despite violating every principle of safe bridge construction, proving that sometimes tactical necessity justifies accepting risks that peacetime logic considers unacceptable. The bridges were unstable, dangerous, and built with inadequate materials under impossible conditions. But they worked. They crossed the Rhine in 10 hours instead of 10 weeks, and that made all the difference between victory in spring 1945 and potentially continued war into summer or fall. The final accounting of the Remagen operation documented achievements that would have been considered impossible by any objective pre-war engineering analysis. 9 bridges constructed across a major European river under and continuous enemy fire. Over 130,000 troops, 25,000 vehicles, and 60,000 tons of supplies moved across those bridges in the first 3 weeks of operation. Aggregate bridge operational time exceeding 2,200 hours despite continuous artillery bombardment and marginal structural stability. The cost was measured in casualty lists that engineering units filed with grim regularity throughout the operation. But the alternative cost, measured in additional months of war and hundreds of thousands of casualties if the Rhine crossing had been delayed, justified the risks that combat engineers had accepted on those cold March days beside the river. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.